Good morning, everybody. Well, the second subject is not a lot more pleasant than the first one, but I think the conclusion will be a similar one: that Islamist terrorism does not pose an existential threat to the Saudi state and the Saudi regime, but that it is a topic that we have to take a closer look at if we want to know what is going on in the country. We have seen a rising number of terrorist incidents in Saudi Arabia in recent years, especially since the declaration of the so-called Islamic State in Syria and Iraq in June 2014, and especially since November 2014, when the organization began to build its own affiliate network in the Arab world. You have all heard about the affiliates in Libya, about the one on the Sinai, probably very close to here, but also the one in Yemen is quite interesting and has been extremely active, not only in Yemen but also in Saudi Arabia. I will argue that there is a connection between IS in Yemen and IS in Saudi Arabia in the last 2 years. These attacks have targeted two main groups of people in the country. First, Shia. The organization for the first time has attacked Shia places of worship in the eastern province, which was quite puzzling to me because this is an area that is highly that is under surveillance by the Saudi security services. The Shia themselves, they have their own, well, I wouldn't call them militia, but small groups of people who protect these places. But it was possible for the organization to perpetrate major attacks against Shia mosques in the eastern province. And secondly, the organization has tried to target Saudi Arabian security personnel. The main attacks have been one on a mosque in Qatif, the old center of Shia resistance to the Saudi state, in May 2015. In August, on a Sunni mosque in Abha, although that was a mosque mainly frequented by members of the security forces, and that is why it became a target. And in October, we saw an attack, October 2015, an attack on a mosque, but that was a shooting incident in Qatif again. Plus, we have seen isolated attacks on security personnel. And my impression is that because the organization did not have the means, or does not have the means, to attack the security forces head-on, it tried to prompt Saudi Arabian family members of the security forces to attack their relatives. And we had some rather nasty attacks where cousins killed a sergeant in the security forces, and so on. And I do not think that these attacks or the organizations, IS or Al-Qaeda, pose, as I said, an existential threat to the state, but these attacks come at a difficult point in time, especially because of the recently escalating conflict with Iran and the rise of sectarian tensions, not only in the region, but in Saudi Arabia as well. And if we want to put this new threat into perspective, I think we have to go back to the last major terrorist campaign in the kingdom in the years 2003 and 2005. In a way, Saudi Arabia is a terrorist or jihadist paradox. They arguably, at least I would argue, that they have the strongest jihadist scene worldwide, absent a major insurgency or a civil war like in Afghanistan, Iraq, or Syria. But still, we have long periods where nothing happens in the kingdom. And this is definitely not due to the fact that the number is low. The number of jihadists in Saudi Arabia is higher than in any other country worldwide. And the main reason seems to be, or seems to have been, perhaps, that Saudis until now always preferred to fight abroad. I'm not really sure about the reasons. One reason might be relatively strong security services, if compared to Iraq, if compared to Afghanistan, perhaps. But secondly, there seems to be an ideological predisposition or a hesitancy to strike in Saudi Arabia itself. We have seen major exceptions. We had a major attack on the Grand Mosque in Mecca in 1979. We did have a major attack, probably Al-Qaeda inspired, as people say today, in 1995. And we had a major terrorist campaign by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in the years 2003 until 2005. And this was, although it was a short terrorist campaign, that was quite a threatening event. I remember that policymakers worldwide, especially in Europe, were extremely worried about what these attacks, intensifying attacks, especially in 2003 and 2004, might mean for the stability of the country. And I think, although the security services, with American help, were able to suppress this campaign quite quickly, and although Al-Qaeda quickly lost public support because it attacked Muslims and Muslim civilians, especially in an attack on the Muhayya compound in Riyadh in November 2003, the example of the campaign of 2003 and 2004 should worry us to some extent, because it shows us what a small group of terrorists, although they do not enjoy public support, is able to do in a country like Saudi Arabia. My second point, though, is the situation in Yemen and its repercussions on what is happening. Because the threat today is not only a domestic threat to Saudi Arabia, but it is one that is deeply connected to developments in neighboring Yemen. In 2005-2006, this old Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula lost its fight against the Saudi state, and we have not seen any major activity by the organization Al-Qaeda in the kingdom since then. In spite of several efforts to perpetrate attacks, most seriously was the attack on Mohammed bin Nayef, then the Vice Interior or Deputy Interior Minister in 2009. He was not killed, but the attack did have an effect on the family that felt relatively secure until then. The very fact that it was possible for a suicide bomber to approach the Deputy Minister of the Interior shocked the family, it shocked Mohammed bin Nayef, and I think it had an influence on the family. It might have had an influence that is visible until today. In 2009, a new organization named itself Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And although it carries the same name, it is a different organization. It is led by Yemenis, but it still has a very strong Saudi component. And that is why it is still following the old agenda. So although it is a major force in Yemen, and although this is the Al-Qaeda affiliate, the only Al-Qaeda affiliate that has attempted to perpetrate attacks on the mainland United States, it also has a Saudi agenda. And one of its main aims is to perpetrate attacks in Saudi Arabia, which is evidence for the strong links between the jihadist scenes in both countries, which have grown ever since the 1980s and are in a way embodied in the person of Osama bin Laden, who was of Yemeni origin, as you all know, but a Saudi citizen at least until 1994. Al-Qaeda, though, was quite unsuccessful in its attempt to perpetrate attacks in the neighboring country. And that is, I have to confess, puzzling me. And that's a question to you all, if you have whether you have an answer. Al-Qaeda, with all its strength in Yemen, perhaps 5,000 fighters today, in spite of all its strength in Yemen, was not able to perpetrate a major attack in Saudi Arabia ever since it was founded, well, practically in 2007 and 2008. And now look at the situation. We have an organization like IS in Yemen, I don't know whether it has structures in Saudi Arabia, but it is able to perpetrate major attacks in highly secured places like Qatif and in relatively well-secured places like Abha. My impression is that there is a very strong link between IS in Yemen and in Saudi Arabia. My main evidence for this is one attack. That was the one that I mentioned on May 22, 2015. That was the first suicide bombing perpetrated by IS in Saudi Arabia, in Qatif. I have mentioned it. And it was seemingly coordinated with a similar attack on a Zaidi mosque in Sana'a. I think that is evidence that these two organizations, or that the different IS cells in Yemen and in Saudi Arabia cooperate. In terms of numbers, IS in Yemen is not stronger than a few hundred fighters, and I still wonder how is it possible for them to project power to Saudi Arabia in such a way. And the problem about it is that we do see, not only in Yemen and in Saudi Arabia, a quite vivid competition between Al-Qaeda and IS, and my theory is that Al-Qaeda, in order to remain relevant for recruits and for finances, has to follow up. They have to perpetrate attacks in Saudi Arabia if they do not want to keep losing recruits and money to the new contender. My third point is rather something for the Islamicists among you, or the Orientalists, if I might say so, in Israel. I ask myself whether the developments in this competition between Al-Qaeda and IS do mean anything for the interpretation of Islamism and Salafism in general. About 18 months ago, just before the attacks in Paris, you remember the first ones on Charlie Hebdo, perpetrated by Al-Qaeda members who had, well, one of them at least had been trained in Yemen. I would have argued that Al-Qaeda is by far the stronger organization, and by far the stronger and especially by far the stronger strategic and ideological model than IS is. And the situation in Yemen was evidence, because IS was emerging in this country already, but still it had no chance because Al-Qaeda was and remains until today the leading jihadist player in the country, because it has so strong because Al-Qaeda has built so strong social roots over the course of the last 20 years. Different evidence was the strength of the Nusra Front. Although it's smaller in Syria, although it is smaller, it follows a much riper strategy, and I am convinced that even if IS perhaps one day is beaten in Syria, the Nusra Front will remain there, simply because they have so powerful allies, simply because they have followed strategies which will prove to be a lot more successful than IS strategies. Namely, IS fighting the whole world, everybody like the Syrian regime, the Iraqi regime, the Druze, the Christians, perhaps one day the Israelis, the Germans, the French, the Americans. That is not really a strategy that will be successful in the long run. But having said that, and having thought that Al-Qaeda was the more important model for the future of the jihadist scene, I think there were two phenomena which pointed in a different direction. One of them was the growth of affiliates, and especially the fact that in 2015 it became obvious that IS was the stronger organization, at least operationally, in the jihadist heartland. And I consider Saudi Arabia to be the great prize of international jihadism, an organization that wants to show that it is relevant and that it is the world leader of the jihadist movement, has to show that it is able to fight the Saudi state. But also the other affiliates were an example. And the second one was something that puzzled me perhaps even more, and that was the extreme attractiveness of IS ideology, and possibly of IS strategies for so many foreigners. Look at the situation in Syria in 2013 and the following years, and you will realize that most foreign fighters left all the other organizations. Not only the Nusra Front, which never had that many fighters, but all these smaller organizations in its vicinities. The French, the Germans, the Belgians, the Saudis, the Moroccans, the Tunisians, most of them, more than 80% of them. I think Ayman once wrote about 80% of the foreigners went. My impression is that, especially among the Germans that I know better than most others, the ratio was even higher. More than 80% of all foreign fighters left these organizations and joined IS. Great, yeah. And as a result, I started to ask myself, what is so attractive about the organization? And I had the chance to talk to some returnees in Germany, and I asked them the question, and they said, isn't it obvious? We want to live in an Islamic state. Ala minhaj al-nubuwa, on the model of prophethood, just like the Prophet did in the 7th century in Mecca and Medina. This is what we want. This seems to be so attractive. And my interpretation has always been that IS is in a way the Salafist version of Islamism. And that is why I said that might be a little bit more interesting for the Islamicists among you. Al-Qaeda, in a way, is quite an Islamist organization. It's very pragmatic. It's strategic. It it tries to build alliances with players who are not really acceptable to a pure Salafist, like the Taliban, for example. Oh, that's a problematic field. On the other hand, we have IS, which is more of a Salafist organization. They are not as pragmatic. They are not that much interested in politics. They are interested in building the Sharia state of the 7th century as they see it. And I had to think a lot about a book that I criticized when I first read it, and that was Olivier Roy, when about 10, 12 years ago, he wrote that Islamism is over, it's beaten, and the ideology of the future is what he called neo-fundamentalism, which is nothing else than Salafism. And if that might sound a little bit theoretical to some of you, but if that is true, and if we do see that Salafism is taking over in the jihadist movement, that means something for Saudi Arabia, because it is, doesn't matter what you call it, it is the Salafist state per se. And if IS is making inroads into the Salafist scene in Saudi Arabia, simply because it is closer to the original Wahhabi lore or the original Wahhabi doctrine, that might be theoretical, but I think even more serious threat to the kingdom, as we might see now. Fourthly, that is about the new situation that I talked about. I think Saudi Arabia is now in a different situation like in 2003 and 2005, when it was able to quell the Islamist, the terrorist campaign of Al-Qaeda. At that time, Al-Qaeda fought quite an isolated fight against the Saudi state. Today, we live in a totally new political environment. You might argue that Iran and Saudi Arabia are fighting a Cold War in the region. Sectarian tensions are on the rise also in the kingdom and in neighboring Bahrain, which is in fact a Saudi protectorate. And IS tends to hit, and that is, I think, is important, tends to hit these rupture lines in societies very cleverly. And there it is not that Salafist anymore. They are attacking the Zaydis in Yemen. They are trying to provoke conflicts between the Zaydis and the rest of the population. The Shia in Iraq, the Alavis and the Kurds in Turkey. I wonder whether we'll attack in Europe in the coming months. And my question is, when the situation will become unbearable for the Shia in a country like Saudi Arabia, where they do have problems with official discrimination, where they do have problems with a government that is cracking down even harder on them than in the past. And although I think that the rupture point will be there, will appear a long time from now. I think that is a difference if compared to the situation in 2003. The Saudi state today has more enemies than it had in 2003. And there is another point: sectarian tensions in the region are running high, and we do not know exactly what that means. Just take a look at the activities of the Hashd al-Sha'bi, the popular mobilization forces in Iraq right now. And look at the way they paint their rockets that they fire into Fallujah. There is a name always popping up, Nimr al-Nimr, the Shiite cleric who was executed by the Saudis together with several jihadists in January 2016. That might not mean a lot. That might only be rhetorical. But I think we will see an intensification of support by Shia groups, by the Iranians, for possibly emerging militant actors in the Shia communities of the Gulf. So my conclusion is that Saudi Arabia is under a threat that I do not consider to be existential, but in a way it has never been threatened in the last 20 or 30 years ago. We do see first a new organization which might be better suited than Al-Qaeda to attract Saudi Wahhabis, especially because it taps into the sectarian zeitgeist. I think zeitgeist is an American word, isn't it? It's probably zeitgeist in Yiddish, isn't it? Secondly, a threat that partly emanates from a neighboring country, which is, by all standards, a failed state. And forgive me if I compare it to another failed state, mainly Belgium. I mean, in a way, the situation is similar. France is threatened by the very fact that a neighboring state is not functioning anymore. You might argue that it has never functioned at all, but now there is a terrorist threat. Oh, of course, that is a joke, but I had to think of it because although Saudi Arabia is controlling its border, France is not. That does pose a similar threat, and the kingdom is aware of this threat. But we will see many things happening. We will see repercussions of the conflict in Yemen in the years to come in the border area of Saudi Arabia. Thirdly, Saudi Arabia, as I said, is the great price of jihadist terrorism, and Al-Qaeda and IS have to prove that they are able to perpetrate attacks in the kingdom. If not, they can leave. Fourth, IS attacks a weak point of Saudi and Kuwaiti and Bahraini society, mainly relations to the Shia, and Shia sentiment is running high, not only in these areas, but also in Iraq and in Iran and in Lebanon. And if I was advising the Saudi government, which I am not, never, I would tell them to reduce sectarian tensions. That's my first point. I would think about it politically. In more practical terms, I would urge them to protect special places, and most importantly, the Prophet's Mosque in Medina. Al-Qaeda would have never attacked this place. I think IS is up to it. They are already discussing it on online forums. European returnees, European IS supporters, they are discussing it. I think that is something that the Saudi state has to prepare for in the coming months. Thank you.